I pulled into the parking lot of Nellie's Air Force Base, with the kind of sinking feeling you get when you know you're already the odd one out. The desert sun was blinding, bouncing off rows of spotless windshields. Families in their Sunday best clustered near the entrance of the officers' club, laughing, adjusting uniforms, trading the kind of gossip that only military families carry like oxygen. My little brother's promotion was supposed to be the Ray's family's coronation. Daniel was about to pin on Major, and my parents were glowing as if they had personally written his orders. Mom had spent the morning at a salon. Dad dusted off his service dress jacket like he was reliving his glory days. Everyone had a role, everyone but me. I got out of my car and tugged at the sleeve of my plain blazer. No uniform today. I told myself I wasn't here to steal attention, just to sit quietly, clap when it was over, and maybe escape before the photos. That was the plan. Blend in, stay invisible. The heat shimmered off the pavement as I walked toward the glass doors. A young airman stood at a podium with a tablet, posture stiff, hands just a little too tight on the stylus. The poor kid looked like every junior enlisted who gets voluntold to guard the gate of a big event, half terrified, half determined not to screw up. When it was my turn, I leaned in and said clearly, "Maya Rays." His fingers scrolled, pause, scroll again, his brows furrowed, the silence stretched. Finally, he looked up with that awkward, almost apologetic smile people wear when they are about to ruin your day. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, you're not on the manifest." At first, I laughed under my breath, mistake, maybe a skipped line. "Check again," I said, keeping my voice even. He flipped the tablet toward me. The screen glared in the sunlight. Colin Linda Daniel, Daniel's wife. My name wasn't there, not misspelled, not hidden at the bottom, just erased, and then I heard it. "She's not on the list." My father's voice, flat, certain, standing a few feet away with his arms crossed like a judge pronouncing sentence. A few families nearby chuckled softly, thinking it was a joke, but the smirk on his face told me it wasn't. I froze, the sting cutting deeper than I expected. It wasn't shock, I'd spent years being sidelined, but the public nature of it hit like sandpaper on a scar. In front of strangers, at the door of my brother's big day. Through the glass I could see Daniel already inside, beaming in his fresh blues, polished shoes catching the light like he'd stepped out of a recruitment poster. Mom hovered, adjusting his tie as if he were still a kid on his way to a school play. Every smile in that lobby was pointed at him. None of them even glanced outside. I turned back to the airman. "I'm his sister, I should be on there." He swallowed hard, glanced at my father, then back at the screen. His voice dropped to a whisper. "I'm sorry, ma'am, without your name I can't let you in." And that was it. People brushed past me, eager for champagne and photo ops. My parents didn't pause, didn't even acknowledge me. Dad adjusted his jacket like he was stepping onto a stage. Mom's hand looped through his arm. The doors closed behind them with a soft click that felt louder than a slammed gate. I stood there on the steps, sun biting into my shoulders, laughter echoing through glass, and felt the weight of a truth I'd carried for decades. In the Ray's family album, Daniel was the star. I was the blurry figure cropped out of the frame. Today wasn't a mistake, it was deliberate. They wanted me gone. I walked back toward my car, keys clenched in my fist so tight the metal pressed crescents into my palm. I could have driven away, gone home, changed into sweats and let them own the story again. That was the role I usually played, the invisible sibling, the clipboard kid. But as I leaned against the trunk, trying to steady my breathing, I felt the hard edge of something inside the car. The garment bag, the one I carried out of habit, pressed and ready for orders that could drop at any hour. That uniform had survived long nights in windowless operations centers, missions that never made headlines, and responsibilities heavier than most people would ever understand. My family didn't know, they'd never cared to ask, and maybe that was my fault for keeping it quiet. But staring at those locked doors, hearing applause muffled through the walls, one thought hit harder than the heat beating down on me. Silence wasn't strength anymore, it was surrender. When I was a kid, our backyard looked less like a playground and more like a training ground. Dad would line us up like we were cadets instead of children. Daniel got the stopwatch, the whistle, and Dad's booming encouragement as he ran laps like a future squadron commander. Me, I was told to hold the clipboard. Clipboard kid, that was my role. I remember one barbecue when the whole neighborhood showed up. Dad had just rotated back from deployment, and he decided it was the perfect time to announce that Daniel had been accepted into the Air Force Academy. Mom beamed like fireworks had gone off. Neighbors clapped, uncles slapped Dad on the back. Daniel strutted across the lawn like he'd already earned his wings. That same week, I had taken first place in a national math and cyber defense competition. I stayed up nights breaking codes, spotting patterns, outsmarting kids from across the country. I brought the medal outside, finally proud enough to show it. Dad glanced at it once and said, "That's nice, Maya, but it's not a commission." The neighbors laughed politely like it was a joke worth repeating. I stood there, medal in hand, feeling smaller than ever. That's how it always was. Photos tilted toward Daniel, holiday toasts aimed at him. My name, if it came up at all, was a footnote. I learned early that trying to compete on their terms, running faster, shouting louder, was a game I could never win. Daniel was built for the parade ground. I was built for puzzles. My victories didn't come with trophies you could mount on the living room wall. So when I joined the Air Force, nobody celebrated. Dad expected me to chase a fighter slot, maybe pilot training, something he could brag about at the VFW. Instead, I went into intelligence. Not the kind of role you see in recruiting posters. No roaring engines, no photos on the flight line. Just dim rooms, glowing screens, endless streams of data. Boring, at least to everyone outside. To me, it felt like actual power. My first assignment was aboard a command post, squeezed into a room that smelled like coffee and stress. I wasn't running flight drills, I was running code, tracking anomalies most people would scroll right past. It didn't take long for people to notice I had a knack. I could see patterns in the noise that others missed. That's how I earned the call sign Watchtower. Not flashy, not heroic, just always watching. One night I picked up strange signals buried in navigation chatter. Everyone else dismissed it as static. I dug deeper. It turned out to be a spoofing attempt aimed at the guidance system of a KC-46 tanker. If it had slipped through, an entire refueling mission could have gone sideways. Hundreds of lives, billions in hardware, all hinging on a few lines of code. I built decoys, firewalled the attack, and sent the intruders chasing ghosts across the Pacific. Nobody outside our little room ever knew. Another time, in the middle of winter, 2 pilots punched out over frozen terrain. Weather was closing in, rescue assets scrambling but blind. Command was paralyzed. I rerouted satellite coverage, borrowed feeds that weren't mine to borrow, and stitched together a corridor. 17 minutes of visibility. Enough for pararescue jumpers to get in, pull those men out, and live to complain about the cold later. Official reports called it timely coordination. I called it refusing to let 2 dots on a screen fade into silence. Then there was Operation Black Kestrel. On paper, just another freighter moving supplies through an international corridor. But the numbers didn't add up. Heat signatures on manifests didn't match. My gut said weapons. I stayed on the data, traced chatter, pushed the call. We vectored in Navy and Allied aircraft, boxed the ship in before it could vanish. Hold full of rifles and explosives, seized without a shot fired. Another near crisis erased from the map. Another line item buried under classification. I went back to my quarters each time with no applause, no champagne, no toasts. Just exhaustion, the smell of my uniform, and sometimes a quiet good work from an officer who knew what almost happened. Meanwhile, my family was flooding email chains with photos of Daniel at banquets, Daniel shaking hands with generals, Daniel leading formations. My promotions, my missions. At best, a one-line mention, Meyer advanced too, like a grocery list item. You can tell yourself family doesn't matter, that respect at work is enough. But silence from the people who raised you, that silence sticks. And when the people who claim to know you best erase your name from a guest list, that silence starts to feel like surrender. So standing in that parking lot outside Daniel's ceremony, hearing applause bleed through the walls, I thought about every moment like this. Every barbecue where I was invisible. Every medal dismissed as not a commission. Every mission that never made it to the family dinner table. They thought I was still clipboard kid. They thought erasing me from the manifest would erase me from the story. They had no idea who Watchtower had become. I sat behind the wheel of my car, doors closed, air stifling. The laughter spilling from the officers' club leaked through the glass like it was taunting me. Every cheer, every clink of glass was a reminder that my name had been scrubbed from the story. For a long minute, I just gripped the steering wheel. The leather groaned under the pressure of my hands. I could have turned the key, driven away, let the Mercer family script keep running exactly as written. Daniel the star, Maya the shadow. That's what they expected. That's what I'd always done. But my eyes dropped to the back seat. The garment bag lay across the cushions, zipper gleaming in the sun. I'd thrown it in the car that morning out of habit. I always kept it close. Intel officers don't know when a call will come, when you'll be needed at 0200 for something no one outside the room will ever hear about. For years it was insurance. For years it was just fabric. Now, staring at it, I realized it was something else. It was the one thing they couldn't erase. I closed my eyes and thought of every time my father waved off my accomplishments like they were hobbies. That's nice, Maya, but it's not a commission. I thought of every family dinner where Daniel's stories swallowed mine whole. Thought of the night I stayed up 36 hours to keep a carrier strike group from being blinded, and the next morning received a family email chain where the only news that mattered was Daniel's new leadership seminar. The garment bag waited, silent, heavy, proof. I popped the trunk and pulled it out. The sun caught the silver insignia through the plastic, and for a moment it felt like the desert air cooled. I unzipped it slowly, each tooth of the zipper snapping like a drumbeat. Inside was my mess dress, pressed whites, polished buttons, creases sharp enough to cut. I had ironed it last night out of reflex, not planning to wear it today. Funny how instinct had prepared me for the moment I'd been avoiding my whole life. Piece by piece, I changed in the front seat. The blazer came off, the slacks folded away. Jacket slid over my shoulders, collar settling against my neck like armor. I fastened each button with deliberate care, not rushing, not hesitating. The ritual steadied me, quieted the noise outside. Then came the silver oak leaves, Lieutenant Colonel. I held them in my palm for a long second, their weight heavier than the metal itself. These weren't decorations. They were a ledger of choices, of nights no one clapped for, of decisions that kept people alive while my family pretended I was invisible. I clipped them onto my shoulder boards, one side then the other, the click echoing like a gavel striking wood. The mirror on the visor reflected a stranger and a truth, not clipboard kid, not forgotten sister, not the erased name on a tablet at the door. What I saw was Watchtower, an officer who had carried lives on her screen and refused to let them vanish. An officer who had been promoted faster than most, not because of applause but because of outcomes. My hand stopped shaking. Outside, the applause inside swelled again. MC warming up the crowd, Daniel probably adjusting his tie, Mom beaming, Dad's chest puffed like he had raised George Washington himself. They didn't know what was coming. I slid the cover onto my head, squared it, and stepped out of the car. The sun slammed into the whites of my uniform, forcing people in the parking lot to pause, squint, and stare. Conversations cut short, heads turned. None of them knew my name yet, but they could see I belonged. That's the thing about the uniform, it does the talking before you ever open your mouth. Each step toward the entrance felt like rewriting a line of the family script. For once, I wasn't going to beg for a seat at the table. I wasn't going to wait for someone else to acknowledge me. This wasn't about revenge, and it wasn't about theatrics. It was about refusing to let silence define me any longer. At the doorway, the young airman with the tablet froze. His eyes shot from the silver oak leaves to my face, then back again. He didn't even bother scrolling. His back straightened, shoulders locking into posture. For a second, his hand twitched like he wanted to salute but wasn't sure if he was allowed. I gave him a single nod. Nothing more, nothing less. Then I pushed the doors open. The sound hit me full force, laughter, clinking glasses, the hum of 100 conversations. My heels clicked against the polished wood, each tap louder than the applause meant for someone else. Portraits of past officers lined the hallway, glass reflecting my image as I passed. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a blur at the edge of the frame. I was the frame. I kept walking. Steady, visible, and for the first time, it wasn't about them letting me in. It was about me claiming the space that had always been mine. The double doors opened, and the sound swallowed me whole. 100 voices tangled together, laughter, glasses clinking, the master of ceremonies warming up the microphone. Every eye was focused on the stage where Daniel stood front and center, uniform pressed within an inch of perfection, smile polished like a recruiter's poster. My heels struck the polished floor, click, 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 each step echoing louder than it should. Heads turned. Whispers started. Most of the crowd assumed I was another officer late to the ceremony. But as I moved down the aisle, the silver oak leaves on my shoulders caught the light, and recognition spread like a ripple on water. Daniel's smile faltered when his eyes found mine. For once, he didn't have a comeback ready. His posture stiffened, eyes darting toward Dad in the front row, but even he seemed caught off guard. Mom's hands froze mid-clap, her face pale. I didn't speed up. I didn't slow down, just steady. Halfway down the aisle, it happened. A pararescue jumper, a PJ sitting shoulder to shoulder with his teammates, blinked, looked again, and then shot to his feet. His chair scraped across the wood with a screech that cut through the applause. His voice carried like a command detonating in the room. Room, attention. The words slammed into the hall like a shockwave. In an instant, 300 bodies rose as one. Boots hammered the floor. Spines snapped straight. The sound of chairs clattering back echoed like thunder rolling through the room. Conversations stopped. Applause died mid-palm. Every head turned toward me. The master of ceremonies froze at the podium, mouth open, microphone squealing as he tried to recover. His voice cracked. He glanced nervously from the crowd to the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, but his script didn't matter anymore. The script had been burned the second those PJs and pilots locked their heels together and stood for me. I walked the aisle with 300 sets of eyes tracking me. Not with curiosity, with recognition. Not for my family name, not for a staged photo, but for the work I had done in rooms with no windows and no applause. These were the men whose missions had survived because Watchtower refused to let them die in the dark. Their respect hit harder than any applause I'd ever heard. Daniel's face was a storm. He lifted his chin like he was trying to pretend he wasn't rattled, but his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack. Dad still held his glass half raised, caught mid-toast, as if someone had ripped the floor out from under him. His stare drilled into me, confused, angry, maybe even scared. Mom's hand covered her mouth, eyes wide, tears pooling for reasons she probably didn't understand. The MC swallowed hard, trying again, voice trembling. Ladies and gentlemen, Lieutenant Colonel Maya Reyes. My name rang out across the hall, for once not erased, not a footnote, not a mistake, my name. The applause that followed was hesitant, uneven at first. Some clapped politely, others looked stunned, a few exchanged glances like they'd just learned a secret they weren't supposed to know. But behind me, the pararescue and pilots stayed locked in place at rigid attention, their boots still biting into the floor. They weren't clapping. They weren't smiling. They were standing because they knew. Every mission, every decision, every risk I had carried in silence, they had lived it. They were alive because of it. And now they were showing it in the only language that mattered. I kept walking, not smiling, not waving. This wasn't about theatrics. This was about visibility, finally undeniable. The aisle parted on its own. Commanders shifted their knees. Enlisted leaned back. Civilians stepped aside. Nobody dared to block the path. The whispering grew louder, cresting like a tide. Who is she? How did we not know? At the front row, I stopped. My cover rested in my lap as I sat down slowly, shoulders squared, eyes forward. I didn't need to look left or right. The silence in the boots had already said enough. Behind me, the synchronized crash of 300 chairs hitting the floor as they sat back down shook the hall harder than any round of applause. It was deafening. It was final. It was respect carved into wood and air. The MC tried to continue, stumbling over Daniel's name, his script unraveling like a thread pulled loose. Daniel's smile returned, forced and brittle. Every line he delivered wavered, every pause longer than it should have been. He wasn't the center anymore. No matter how many times Dad leaned forward, clapping like he could will the spotlight back, the room had already shifted. I sat there, silent, steady. For the first time in my life, I didn't need to prove anything. The room already knew. And the story the Reyes family had tried to write, that Daniel was the legacy, that Maya was the shadow, had just been rewritten in front of 300 witnesses. For a long breath after the chairs slammed back to the floor, no one seemed to remember what came next. The master of ceremonies shuffled papers that no longer mattered. Daniel clung to the podium like a man riding out turbulence he never saw on the forecast. Dad's glass made a small, lonely clink as he finally set it down. Ceremonies have a rhythm: open, honors, remarks, pin, salute, photos. This one moved forward on muscle memory alone, but the music had changed. Every announcement landed a half beat late. Every laugh sounded borrowed. The MC fast-forwarded through sections that were supposed to sparkle, like he was trying to outrun the moment that had just rearranged the room. I sat front row, cover in my lap, spine straight. I didn't look left, didn't look right. I just let the weight of what had happened settle into the wood under my shoes. When you've spent years being erased, you learn to sit still when your name finally takes up space. During a pause, the first one approached. A colonel with storm-colored hair and the kind of ribbon rack that says he's seen the map from both edges. He didn't make a show of it. He just stepped into the aisle, offered his hand, and said quietly, "Good to finally put a face to Watchtower." No small talk, no questions he knew he couldn't ask. Just respect stated and done. He squeezed once and moved on. Then a pararescue team chief, boots scuffed, jaw shadowed, stopped short like he'd walked into an answer he'd been hoping to find. We made it out of White Summit because someone pulled a corridor out of nothing. His eyes flicked to my oak leaves and back. Figured it was you. He didn't wait for my answer. He didn't need one. He touched 2 fingers to his temple in something that wasn't quite a salute and melted back into his row. A flight lead from the tanker wing came next, voice low enough to vanish between us. If that spoofing got through, we'd still be untangling the mess. Appreciate the wall you built. His nod was small, but it carried more mass than all the applause that had evaporated earlier. None of them lingered. No one asked for a photo. The acknowledgments came in a steady stream, 1 handshake, 2 words out. It was like watching signatures appear on a document only a few of us were allowed to see. No cameras, no hashtags, just a quiet ledger being balanced at last. Daniel tried to keep his speech airborne, but every stumble made it clear the center of gravity had shifted. The crowd still clapped at the right places. Training is training, but the attention didn't stick to him like it used to. It ricocheted, it came back to the aisle, to the boots that had slammed down, to the woman in the front row who wasn't supposed to be here at all. Eventually, the formalities ran out of oxygen and the program released everyone to mingle. Conversations sparked like static, small clusters forming, dissolving, reforming. The buffet line crawled. The bar hustled. The MC disappeared entirely, as if he could climb back into a script that had been set on fire. Mom reached me first, hands trembling, eyes wet in a way I hadn't seen since I left for basic. "You look," she searched for a word that wasn't beautiful or impressive. She found real. "You look real, Maya." She reached for my sleeve, then thought better of it and folded her hands tight. "Why didn't you tell us?" "I could have said 100 things because you never asked. Because I couldn't, because you wouldn't have believed me. I picked the only one that wouldn't reopen the wound in public. It wasn't mine to tell." Behind her, Dad stood up with the deliberateness of a man deciding whether to salute or retreat. He walked over, slow and stiff, like his joints had rusted in a single position, pride aimed in only one direction for too many years. He stopped a foot away, eyes moving over the lines of my uniform as if he had to translate what he was seeing into a language he understood. No apology came, no grand speech, just a single heavy nod. The kind of nod men give on flight lines when a jet taxis past and both of you know what it took to keep it in the air. It wasn't everything, but it was more than I'd ever gotten. I returned it, just as small, just as heavy. Daniel finally peeled away from his circle and approached. The smile he wore for the room had fallen off somewhere between the podium and me. Up close, he looked younger, which is something you never want to notice on a day that's supposed to make you look older. He stopped so close I could see the tiny tremor in his jaw. "How long?" he asked, keeping his voice low enough to get lost under the hum of conversation. "Long enough," I said. He let out a breath that wasn't quite a laugh. "I kept trying to outrun you." His eyes dropped to my oak leaves, then rose again. "Didn't realize I was running in place." There was no victory in it for me, no taste for gloating. I had spent too many nights moving satellites and code and people's lives by inches to waste motion now. I just said, "We carry different parts of the same sky." He nodded, the words catching then settling. "Thank you for coming," he said, "not sorry, not yet. But thank you was a door that hadn't existed an hour ago." Around us, the micro-acknowledgements kept arriving. A vice wing commander with a handshake that felt like a sealed envelope. A weather officer mouthing 17 minutes and tapping his watch. An air traffic controller who just put his hand on his chest and moved on without a word. I thought about the difference between applause and recognition. Applause is a wave, loud, bright, and gone before it reaches shore. Recognition is sediment. It settles layers, becomes something you can stand on. Today had both, but only one of them felt like it would last. By the time the crowd thinned, the room had exhaled into something almost normal. Photos resumed. Laughter found its footing. The bar caught up. If you didn't know what had happened, you might think you'd imagine the shockwave. But every so often, a glance cut across the room and landed on me, not hungry, not hostile, just recalibrated. As if the map had been corrected and people were quietly updating their routes. On my way toward the exit, Dad stepped into my path. He didn't block. He didn't command. He just stood where I had to look him in the eye. His voice dropped to a register I'd only heard in old deployment stories. "You did good," he said. "Not you look good. You did." Past tense, present respect. I felt the old ache press against my ribs, then loosen its grip. "So did he," I said, tipping my head toward Daniel. "Different front." Dad's mouth worked around words he didn't have. "The best men I've known say less when it matters more." He settled for another nod, deeper this time, like a weight being set down. Outside, the desert light had softened. The heat was still there, but it wasn't punishing. I held the door for a pair of PJs hauling laughter and paper plates. One of them paused, chin lifting. "Good to have you in the room, ma'am." "I was always in the room," I said, and for the first time the line didn't hurt. They grinned and disappeared into the evening. I stood there a second longer, letting the cooler air find its way into the corners of my lungs. The night wasn't a fairy tale. No one had rewritten the past with a toast and a hug, but something had moved. Not a parade, more like a tectonic plate finally skipping forward a few inches after years of pressure. Recognition without applause. I didn't need the first anymore, and I'd finally learned how to live without the second. Tomorrow the emails would go back to being careful, the reports back to thick paper and black marker lines. But there would be a medal in a cabinet soon, and a new silence in our family. The kind you get when people are thinking instead of dismissing. For the first time, I believed the last act wouldn't be written for me. I could write it myself, and I knew exactly where it would begin. 6 months later, the crunch of gravel under my tires felt like déjà vu. Same brick house. Same flag fluttering on the porch. Same hedges trimmed sharp enough to pass inspection. Nothing about my parents' home looked different from the outside, but I knew better. The script had been rewritten and the evidence was waiting inside. The smell of roast beef and garlic hit me as soon as I opened the door. Mom's gourmet for big family dinners. A comfort blanket made out of food. I hung my cover on the same hook where Dad always kept his. My reflection in the hallway mirror caught me, silver oak leaves bright against my shoulders. For once, the sight didn't feel like a secret costume. Then I saw it. The cabinet, the shrine that had always belonged to Daniel. Academy photos lined up in perfect order. His polished saber. The framed program from his first big assignment. For years, that glass case had been a monument to only one child. But now, right in the center, was something new. A ribbon of mine mounted neatly, catching the kitchen light. I stopped longer than I should have, staring. It wasn't about the medal itself. I had plenty locked away in drawers, tucked into boxes. It was about placement. Dead center, not hidden in a corner, not squeezed at the bottom. A piece of me planted where no one could erase it. "Dinner's ready," Mom called from the kitchen. At the table, things looked the same, plates lined like formation, Dad pouring water with parade ground precision, Daniel setting down his phone. But the air was different, sharper, tuned. For once I didn't feel like I had to clear my throat to be heard. Mom asked me about work, not vague questions, but specific ones. How do you manage a team when they're spread across continents? How do you sleep when you're carrying that much weight? She wanted answers. She listened. Really listened. Even Daniel leaned forward. How do you make those calls in seconds? You know, the ones that keep people alive? His fork hovered midair as if he didn't want to miss a word. I told them the truth, not classified, not the details, but the reality. The endless screens, the weight of time slipping faster than your pulse. The balance between precision and humanity. For once, nobody cut me off. Nobody pivoted back to Daniel. The room stayed on me. After dessert, Dad and Mom cleared the plates. Daniel lingered across the table, fiddling with his napkin. Finally, he looked up. His voice carried something I'd never heard in it before: hesitation. "I always thought I had to stay ahead of you," he said quietly. "Like if I slowed down, you'd catch me. Turns out I was chasing shadows I couldn't outrun." He gave a short laugh, not bitter, honest. "I never realized you were carrying a different kind of weight." I didn't gloat, didn't fire back. I just smiled because in that moment I understood. We'd been running different races all along. He chased applause, I carried silence. Neither was easy, but mine had been invisible until the day I decided to stop disappearing. Driving home that night, the headlights cut clean lines across the asphalt. The metal in the cabinet wasn't what filled me. The dinner conversation wasn't what made me whole. What mattered was months earlier, when I chose to walk into that hall on my own terms. I realized then that recognition had never been theirs to give. It had always been mine to claim. The seals standing, the boots slamming, the quiet nod from a father who'd never seen me before, the medal in the middle of a glass case. All of it mattered, but none of it defined me. The real victory came the moment I stopped waiting for permission. I wasn't invisible anymore, and even if they tried, they could never erase me again. I learned something standing in that hall and again at that dinner table. Recognition doesn't come from applause or medals in a cabinet. It comes the moment you decide you're done being erased. That was the day I claimed my place, not because they let me in, but because I chose to show up. And maybe that's why I'm telling you this now. Because I know I'm not the only one who's ever felt invisible in their own story. If you've ever carried weight no one clapped for, if you've ever been the shadow in someone else's spotlight, this space is for you. So stick around, share your thoughts in the comments. Hit like if you felt this silence before. Subscribe if you want more stories that remind you you are not alone. And share this with someone who needs to hear that their place can't be erased. Because sometimes the loudest statement you'll ever make is simply refusing to disappear.